A telephone rings in a dim room of a stone chateau outside Bayeux, its note thin against the hush of late afternoon. Maps lie unfolded across a long table, pins and string marking roads chewed into mud, beaches rimmed in blue, and the names of villages that mean everything to the men whose lives depend on the orders written here. A field marshal stands over those maps with hands that have known the weight of command for decades. He looks out a window toward the coast where, 50 miles away, an Allied armada still bobs beyond the horizon. It is June, 19 days after the Allied invasion that would come to be called D-Day. And on the line between the chateau and Berlin runs the deadliest question the German military has faced in generations: how to use the armored forces they still possess, and whether blunt truth can pierce the ceiling of fear hanging over the German high command. This is the story of Gerd von Rundstedt at that late afternoon, a long-career soldier confronted by the collapse of the framework he had served his whole life to maintain. It is a story about doctrine and delay, about telephones and timetables, and about a system that made it nearly impossible to tell the truth. 19 days after D-Day, von Rundstedt would send a message that cut through the fog of deference and denial. But the hours before that sentence, the arguments and the calculations that preceded it, tell us how an empire strangled its own chance of a coherent response. If this episode speaks to you, and you want more detailed WW2 stories like this one, hit like and subscribe. It helps us make more of these. Gerd von Rundstedt was the sort of professional soldier whose reputation was built on steadiness. Born into the old Prussian officer class, he had served through the First World War, the chaotic interwar years, and the mechanized campaigns of the 1930s and early 1940s. He reached the rank of field marshal not because he sought political favor, but because he administered commands competently. He knew logistics and maneuver, staff work, and the hard arithmetic of supply lines. To many contemporaries, von Rundstedt represented the classical German military tradition: conservative, hierarchically minded, and doctrinally rigorous. He was not an ideologue. He was not a Nazi in the doctrinal sense. He was, however, an officer who functioned inside a criminal state, and who, in that capacity, bore moral responsibility for the orders he carried and, on occasion, the ones he passed along. To understand why the decisions of late June mattered, it helps to step back to the coastline where the Allies had first struck. On June 6th, the greatest amphibious operation in history unfolded. Tens of thousands of men came ashore under blistering fire. They were protected by a vast supporting fleet and a superior Allied air arm. D-Day was not a single explosion so much as a cascade. Airborne assaults inland, naval gunfire shaping the beachheads, deception operations bending German attention away from the true landing zones. The invaders had craft, planes, radios, fuel, and the combination of industrial depth and maritime logistics that let them sustain a fighting force across the Channel. For German commanders, the picture was immediately harsh. Allied air superiority, the Allies controlled the skies in Normandy with thousands of fighters and bombers, meant that any large, exposed movement of troops or armor could be detected and mauled from above. Railways, the arteries that once moved German forces with speed and efficiency, were shredded by Allied bombing and by French resistance sabotage. The German logistical network, especially on the Atlantic coast, was fraying. Fuel shortages, disrupted communications, and wrecked bridges turned any reinforcements into slow-moving targets on narrow roads. Cherbourg, the port the Allies needed to ease their supply flow, had not yet fallen into Allied hands. So the invaders initially relied on what they could bring directly across the Channel, a fragile, growing lifeline that would only strengthen with time. Into that landscape stepped the central strategic question: how to employ armor. The German army had historically favored a doctrine that preserved mechanized units in a central reserve. Concentrated forces kept back so they could strike with mass at an enemy's decisive point. That strategic reserve, the Panzer Reserve, was a core tenet of operational art. Concentration yielded breakthrough, haste scattered power. Von Rundstedt, steeped in that tradition, believed that the correct course was to hold armored divisions until a decisive counterattack could be organized and launched with overwhelming force. Opposing him were officers and commanders closer to the coast who argued for a forward deployment. Move panzer units nearer to the beaches to blunt the invasion immediately. That argument had an appealing immediacy. If the armor was nearby, it could counterattack before the Allies consolidated. It also had a fatal flaw. Given Allied dominance of the air and sea, moving armor in daylight across open roads invited attack from fighters and naval guns. Armor on the march, spread across clogged highways, could not mass effectively. It became a series of tempting targets rather than a hammer ready to fall. The forward defense camp feared that a rigid adherence to preserving a central reserve would permit the Allies to consolidate a lodgment, gather supplies, and then break out with overwhelming numbers. The reserves camp feared that dispersal would waste the panzers in piecemeal skirmishes, destroyed by coordination and firepower before they could fight as a single coordinated strike. Compounding that doctrinal clash was a political chokehold from the top. Adolf Hitler, convinced by his ideology and by intelligence reports that often misread Allied intentions, had placed critical divisions under direct personal control. The requirement for Hitler's authorization to release significant armored units created a procedural bottleneck at the worst possible time. Rather than allowing field commanders the flexibility to respond to a fluid situation, the German system required a round of diplomatic calls and political vetting whenever the weight of armored force needed to be shifted. A telephone line, in other words, became as consequential as a railhead. This centralization of authority, motivated by fear of independent action in the wake of earlier perceived betrayals and failures, removed the agility that mobile warfare demanded. A quick note on terms. When historians say air superiority, they mean one side's ability to operate its aircraft over a battlefield with confidence that the other side will not be able to contest the skies effectively. For Normandy, the Allies enjoyed that advantage from the outset. The Panzer Reserve refers to armored formations, tanks, and the units that support them, kept back from the front until the moment they could strike with concentrated effect. Both concepts matter because they shaped the options available to German commanders and the costs of any choice. The first days after the landings were an anxious scramble. Allied commanders, aware of the difficulties of supply and the need to secure a port, pushed inland methodically. The beaches were bloody but held. Small towns and hedgerows became killing grounds. German counterattacks, when they occurred, were often local and under-resourced. Columns attempted to traverse the bocage and the narrow lanes. They were found by Allied air patrols and caught in the open. The weather, at times unpredictable, could either mask or reveal movements, but the exponential factor that made the difference was the Allied ability to bring overwhelming fire, naval, artillery, and air, to bear on any massed formation caught under the open sky. Behind the lines, the debate hardened into factions. Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B and an advocate for forward defense, believed the invasion could be defeated close to the shore if the defenders reacted rapidly and struck against the lodgements before the Allies gathered strength. Rommel's approach valued speed, anticipated that the Allies could be stopped by aggressive counterattacks. He wanted armor forward, dispersed in small pockets close to likely landing points, and he urged Hitler to devolve authority to field commanders who could act decisively. Von Rundstedt, by contrast, argued for patience and concentration. He had seen what happened when Germany tried to plug every hole with small forces. Defeats stretched into routs, reserves burned away until nothing was left to form a decisive blow. A massed armored counterattack, employing several divisions that could be brought to a single point, remained, to his mind, the only realistic way to roll the Allies back into the sea. He also understood, grimly, the arithmetic of fuel and rail. Even if Hitler authorized movement, getting multiple panzer divisions into position would take time and required secure lines of communication that were increasingly vulnerable. Between the doctrinal debate and the practical impossibility of moving large armored bodies across a landscape under enemy air control lay the intelligence picture. German signals and human intelligence in June were plagued by confusion and by deliberate Allied deception. Operation Fortitude, the Allied camouflage and spoof strategy, had convinced German planners that the main invasion might come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. That uncertainty achieved its purpose. It slowed the German response even where commanders suspected otherwise. For von Rundstedt and others who demanded a massed counterstroke, the specter of deploying against the wrong threat was terrifying. For Rommel and those who feared immediate disaster on the beaches, the fear of delay felt like an invitation to catastrophe. Orders trickled and then stalled. Requests for authorization to move the 21st Panzer Division, for example, required discreet approval from headquarters in Berlin. Radio communications were monitored. Each step toward moving armor required not only the dispatch of staff officers to coordinate rail and road movements, but the political courage to defy assumptions from above. In effect, the German command structure had turned maneuver into petition. Every hour spent waiting for a message from the Führer's headquarters multiplied Allied advantages. And the Allies were not idle. Their interdiction of roads and columns was a steady, remorseless pressure. Allied fighter bombers prowled Normandy's lanes, finding concentrations of trucks and tanks and breaking them up before they could form. From above, mobility became vulnerability. From the ground, mobility was the only means to mass. It was a cruel logic. What saved armored units from destruction was remaining concentrated and moving as one. But concentration invited the very interdiction that Allied air power could inflict without risk of loss. This operational squeeze turned every movement into a gamble. German staff officers produced timetables with grim precision. The time needed to assemble divisions, repair bridges, requisition rail cars, and transfer fuel was measured in days. Each required resource was in competition with another need: reinforcements for the Eastern Front, the necessity of plugging retreats, and the bureaucratic friction of a regime where personal access to the leader determined outcome. In effect, the German command structure had turned maneuver into petition. Every hour spent waiting for a message from the Führer's headquarters multiplied Allied advantages. And the Allies were not idle. Their interdiction of roads and columns was a steady, remorseless pressure. Allied fighter bombers prowled Normandy's lanes, finding concentrations of trucks and tanks and breaking them up before they could form. From above, mobility became vulnerability. From the ground, mobility was the only means to mass. It was a cruel logic. What saved armored units from destruction was remaining concentrated and moving as one. But concentration invited the very interdiction that Allied air power could inflict without risk of loss. This operational squeeze turned every movement into a gamble. German staff officers produced timetables with grim precision. The time needed to assemble divisions, repair bridges, requisition rail cars, and transfer fuel was measured in days. Each required resource was in competition with another need: reinforcements for the Eastern Front, the necessity of plugging retreats, and the bureaucratic friction of a regime where personal access to the leader determined outcome. The result was predictable. While Hitler squabbled over whether a reserve should be released, Allied engineers and logistic units expanded beachheads and established a flow of men and material that would soon dwarf German ability to counter. Amid this bureaucratic smothering, small episodes illustrate the larger rot. Armored columns once authorized to move were rerouted, halted, or held back by petty security concerns and by the fear of Hitler's displeasure. Field commanders turned to intermediaries, Keitel, Jodl, the Supreme Command, to plead for action, but those intermediaries were themselves enmeshed in a culture of caution. Bad intelligence was fed upward as if it were decisive, and worst-case assumptions were made into dogma. In plain terms, German command made it harder to fight a mobile war at the very moment mobility mattered most. The human side of the crisis was brutal. Tank crews stood by engines idling, awaiting fuel that would never arrive in time. Infantrymen marched through fields and hedgerows that hid snares rather than offers of cover. Local commanders, forced to choose between risking annihilation in an immediate counterattack or waiting and hoping for a larger, cleaner strike, faced a decision with moral weight. Commit men to likely death for the chance of a tactical salvation, or conserve forces for a theoretically decisive action that might never come. Those choices were not abstract, they were lived in mud and blood. Conversations in headquarters were clipped and impatient. Reports were colored by fear of making the wrong decision and being punished, fear of taking initiative without certainty, fear of being blamed for failure when the actual source was systemic. For many officers, the calculus was not only military but existential. In a regime where authority was invested in a single person and where dissent could be fatal, professional candor had a cost. Officers learned to couch assessments in the language their superiors wanted to hear. Honest, urgent warnings were risky. Comforting allusions were rewarded. On the afternoon of a crucial council, von Rundstedt walked into a room where voices argued over maps smudged with coffee and cigar ash. He reviewed the situation with the clarity his career had trained him to seek. He could see the timeline, reinforcements that could be assembled on days, not hours, roads that would not sustain a sudden redeployment without decisive authorization, airfields still in Allied hands that would extend Allied reach with every passing day. His conclusion, given the facts before him, was straightforward. Unless large armored formations were permitted to reposition and strike soon, the opportunity for a coherent and potentially decisive counterattack would slip by. In other words, the window in which the German army could mass a counterblow was closing. This was not a call for reckless attack. It was a professional assessment rooted in doctrine and logistics. Mass is decisive in armored warfare. Delay without control over the skies and transport lines makes mass impossible. For von Rundstedt, the choice was surgical. Authorize movement now to form a strike, or accept that piecemeal engagements would sap strength until nothing remained to be concentrated. Rommel's argument, by contrast, was driven by a different logic. The immediacy of the beaches forced action now. The stakes were not merely theoretical. Rommel saw that if the Allies established lodgements and brought ports into operation, the mechanical superiority would shift from a momentary advantage into a sustained torrent. He urged preemptive positioning closer to the front, not for doctrinal grandeur, but for immediate tactical defense. To Rommel, waiting for perfect formation was tantamount to choosing defeat. What neither side could control was the political dimension above them. When Hitler withheld or delayed authorization, it was not always because he disagreed with the operational logic. Often, it was because any release of sizable armored forces threatened his perception of control. Giving generals latitude could lead to independent action, which, in Hitler's worldview, might produce unapproved outcomes or, worse from his perspective, highlight his own fallibility. So instead of granting discretion where professional competence demanded it, his system demanded petitions, council meetings, and confirmation. The delay itself became a tool of control. Tension mounted along that thin line between plans and execution. By mid-June, German reports to Berlin either underestimated Allied strength or overestimated German capacity. Staff officers described gaps in supply and asked for immediate empowerment to move forces. Political leaders in the capital preferred to wait for corroboration or to demand tighter security briefings. The effect was catastrophic in operational terms. Units that should have moved in coordinated waves were pewed, sometimes in the open, sometimes on tracks vulnerable to Allied airstrikes. From the vantage point of the Allies, the scene was one of opportunistic destruction, where columns massed, aircraft and naval gunfire found soft targets and inflicted losses that eroded German ability to fight en masse. An episode often cited by officers on the ground involved a planned deployment of a panzer division through a narrow corridor to a staging area. The scheduled transit required 2 days of secured movement, fuel, and an unobstructed route.
En route, columns encountered congestion from retreating units and civilian refugees. Allied fighter patrols harried the lead vehicles. Authorization messages failed to arrive on time. The result? The formation arrived scattered, low on fuel, and without the necessary repair and supply support. It could neither launch a coordinated strike nor withdraw cleanly. Incidents like this were multiplied across Normandy.
Each one turned theoretical doctrine into lived failure. There is also the moral accounting that cannot be ignored. Von Rundstedt was not immune to culpability. He administered orders and, in documented instances, transmitted directives that contravened lawful protections for certain combatants. The Commando Order, issued earlier in 1942 and requiring summary execution of captured commandos and certain irregular fighters, was one such criminal directive. Von Rundstedt relayed orders through channels for which he bore responsibility. Acknowledging his professional competence must therefore be balanced with recognition of complicity in criminal policies enacted by the regime he served. This moral complexity is essential. Professional skill and ethical failure can coexist, and a sober account needs to hold both truths simultaneously. As days wore on, the tactical situation crystallized into an agonizing fact. The Allies were consolidating their lodgements, constructing supply dumps, and preparing for the next phases of the campaign. Every hour of delay in releasing armored reserves reduced the probability that German commanders could craft a single, decisive counterstroke. Communications remained clogged, and the personality-driven bottleneck at the top, the need for Hitler's explicit authorization for major movements, continued to sap time. By the 19th day after the invasion, the sense of urgency among pragmatic commanders had calcified into alarm. Routes that might have allowed panzer formations to concentrate were more dangerous with every passing dawn. The Allied air umbrella widened. The ports that would sustain a massive Allied buildup were nearing operation. At the same time, the German defensive system, already stretched along an immense coastline, had lost the advantage of surprise and the ability to move as a centralized mass. In short, the window was closing in both physical and temporal terms. Within the German High Command, proponents of immediate action argued that this was not the moment for bureaucratic formalities. They described a scenario in which the Central Reserve, properly released and efficiently moved, could still strike at a seam in the Allied lodgment, a focused, violent blow that might disorganize the landing forces and push them back to the sea. Detractors called this optimism. They pointed to logistical shortfalls, fuel scarcity, and the reality that many units had already seen attrition. Above all, they pointed to the risk that any movement would be detected and punished from the air, turning careful deployments into carcasses of tanks and burned transports. The debate was less an abstract academic dispute and more a moral test of the system. Would the command apparatus reward the officer who delivered unwelcome truth, who said, plainly, that unless decisive movement was authorized immediately, collapse was probable? Or would it reward those who wrapped the situation in cautious hope and avoided the political risk of challenging directives? Systems, as much as people, had incentives. Here, the incentives suppressed candor. Commanders, like von Rundstedt, calculated not only the military odds but the political ones. Would a blunt warning reach the men with the authority to authorize movement? And if it did, would it be heeded? The mental model of von Rundstedt was shaped by years of institutional deference. He knew how rare it was for his assessments to alter political predilections. That awareness made his potential interventions weightier. When honesty risked career, reputations, or worse, the cost of speaking rose steeply. In many ways, the German structure in June 1944 had become a machine that punished precisely those behaviors it needed most: frank assessment, rapid initiative, and decentralized decision-making empowered by professional trust. Instead, it rewarded timorous adherence, conjured certainties, and political flattery. The consequence was not merely an operational failure, but an organizational pathology in which truth was deferred until it became useless. As the 19th day approached, senior commanders compiled situation reports that read like the minutes before a structural collapse. Depleted fuel depots, armored formations partially immobilized, reinforcing divisions held back pending political approval, supply lines vulnerable to interdiction, and an enemy steadily tightening the noose. The reports were numeric and clinical, but their meaning was human. They spoke of exhausted crews, of commanders who had to choose which village to defend and which to concede, of families displaced by constant movement, and of an army working hard to convert limited capacity into decisive effect. Those on the receiving end of communication chains were exhausted by repetitions of the same problems and frustrated by the slow tempo of decision-making. The tension between Rommel's immediacy and von Rundstedt's patience morphed into a larger institutional debate about who would assume responsibility for the fate of the Reich. It is in this seam between professional assessment and political inflexibility that the story reaches its critical moment, a field marshal's final attempt to force clarity on a system that had learned to avoid it. Reconstructed from staff diaries and recorded testimonies, a line attributed to von Rundstedt in the days leading up to the climactic phone call captures this tone of frustrated candor. The situation is grave. Without permission to move the reserves, we will be forced into a sequence of local defeats. This line, reconstructed by historians from multiple contemporaneous notes, is not poetic. It is a professional's report rendered blunt. It is the sort of statement that, in a functioning command, would spur rapid, rational action. In the system that had grown up under Hitler, it would instead collide with fear.
Maps in the chateau showed the rub. Pins marking positions of armored formations that could be massed in principle, set against a network of roads and bridges that required secure operation. Each pin represented an opportunity or a liability. For commanders trying to marshal a counterattack, the arithmetic required not only tanks, but fuel, ammunition, bridging parties, and the permissive window of bad weather that could, paradoxically, obscure movement from Allied air patrols. The weather, the enemy, and the bureaucracy would all play decisive roles. What follows next is the moment at which all these pressures converge, a final attempt to translate professional judgment into political authorization. A message will be drafted. Staff officers will argue about phrasing, lest bluntness provoke a political backlash. A telephone line will be traced mentally and physically from the chateau to the Supreme Headquarters in Berlin. Someone will pick up the receiver and speak into a device whose sound carries not just words, but consequences. At the same time, elsewhere, the Allied machine keeps moving. Engineers pushing toward a usable port, logistics units consolidating supply dumps, and commanders planning the next operation to exploit their growing superiority. Each day of German delay increases the distance between plausible counterattack and plausible victory. Each hour lost becomes a margin for Allied advantage. In the chateau, the lamp burns low. Officers consult binoculars and charts. An adjutant moves quietly, aware that the next dispatch may be the last clear thing written in a long string of evasions. The pressure is both external and internal. External in the form of enemy operations and logistics, internal in the form of a political system that resists the unpleasant truth. This is where the narrative stakes are highest, not on the field where tanks rumble through mud, but in the small wood-paneled rooms that determine whether movement happens at the moment it could still be decisive. The question is not merely military, it is institutional. Will an officer tell the truth when the truth demands an answer that the political center finds uncomfortable? And when that officer tells it, will the machine he serves allow that truth to become action? The stage is set for a message that will break through ordinary protocol. Men in uniforms calculate distances and losses. A map is rolled up and carried to a small telephone corner reserved for urgent communications. A hand reaches for the receiver.
The telephone line, crackling with static across hundreds of kilometers, awaits the voice that will attempt to convert professional judgment into political will. The moment is simple in its mechanics, but immense in its potential outcome. Outside, the wind carries the faint rumble of distant artillery and the muffled sound of trucks on the road. Inside, the chateau's clock ticks and the war's timetable narrows. A decision is required. The hour is late. A hand closed on the receiver. The telephone line hummed as if reluctant to carry a truth that the command structure had trained itself to avoid. On the far end of the wire sat Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, the man whose role was often to translate the front line's urgent practicality into words the Führer might accept. Between the chateau and Keitel's desk lay 1,000 kilometers of politics, protocol, and fear. Between the field marshal and the political center lay the single decision that, by professional calculation, still alter the course of the fighting in Normandy. What von Rundstedt delivered was not a flourish or a plea, but a compact, professional assessment. It was the kind of message practiced officers give when they have exhausted contingency plans and must authorize the cold arithmetic of withdrawal or concentration. Reconstructed from staff notes and later testimony, the message that went to the High Command on that 19th day after the invasion boiled down to one imperative. Unless the armored reserves were allowed to reposition and strike while the window remained open, German forces risked being ground down in a long, attritional campaign they could not win. In the terse language his staff recorded, he urged that the High Command authorize an organized pullback and concentration of armored forces, to withdraw where necessary and assemble for a decisive strike, staff notes later summarized. For purposes of the public memory tied to this episode and to the title that frames it, the message has often been rendered in blunt terms. Von Rundstedt told the German High Command to retreat before it's too late. That formulation is not melodrama. It is a professional warning couched in the vocabulary of operational art. To von Rundstedt, retreat did not mean collapse. Military withdrawals, when ordered and supplied, make space to reorganize lines, protect logistical hubs, and prepare future operations on more favorable terms. He argued for using mobility to reconcentrate strength, not to abandon the fight. The crucial point of his plea was binary: authorize now while roads could still be cleared and fuel allocated, or watch the chances for a concentrated counterattack wither under Allied air and logistical pressure. Keitel listened, and the recording of his internal processes, where they exist, shows a tension between professional military judgment and the political reality of an inflexible center. That telephone transmission, taken seriously, demanded rapid political assent. The OKW could pass on a recommendation, but the decision to free the Panzer Reserve for large-scale movement still required approval in Berlin. For Keitel, the message from von Rundstedt was one among several pressing inputs. From Rommel pressing for local countermeasures, from intelligence assessments muddied by Allied deception, and from Hitler's ideological insistence on central control. Keitel's duty, under the system then prevailing, was as much about managing Hitler's sensitivities as about weighing operational logic. When the transmission reached the Führer, either as a paraphrase through the OKW staff or in fuller form, depending on which account one reads, the reaction was swift and personal. Approving a large, autonomous use of armored forces implied trust in the commanders on the spot. It threatened, in Hitler's mind, a diminution of his own tight grip on strategic choices. For reasons that mixed paranoia, political calculation, and rigid belief in centralized command, Hitler refused the broad discretion the German military needed. The response that came back to the chateau was not merely a veto of the proposed course, it was a rebuke of the man who had issued it. The politics of punishment in Nazi Germany were intimate and immediate. Officers who contradicted the official line risked more than dismissal. They risked being labeled defeatists, an accusation that carried both career and existential peril. For von Rundstedt, the consequence was personal. Within days, he was relieved of his command. Contemporary records and later histories agree on the trajectory, if not on the precise hour-to-hour accounting. The chateau no longer served as his headquarters. The map table that had been his for decades was folded away for someone else to use. The regime's answer to candor was to remove the person who had spoken it. The immediate tactical consequence was not a single sudden collapse. The battlefield is rarely so theatrical. But the removal of an experienced, if compromised, commander at a moment when coherent coordination was sorely needed created a vacuum that accelerated existing dysfunction. Command passed to successors who faced the same structural impediments: Hitler's micromanagement, fractured lines of communication, and a logistics network in tatters, but who had less time and less established authority to reassert a professional approach. Those successors contended with the same set of impossible options: attempt decentralized counterattacks under the hammer of Allied air power, or hope for a political change in Berlin that would never come. Within a short span after the chateau phone call, the Allied operational tempo intensified. One of the most consequential Allied moves in late July, Operation Cobra, an American offensive designed to break out of the bocage and exploit Allied air and armor superiority, exploited precisely the vulnerabilities von Rundstedt had warned about. While the German High Command argued and rearranged, Allied commanders massed, planned, and struck at a seam. Cobra's initial bombardment and subsequent armored thrusts capitalized on a German front that was being bled of mobility and unity. St. Lo and the surrounding sectors, long contested and chewed by hedgerow fighting, collapsed under a combined arms blow that demonstrated what massed, coordinated mobility could do when supplied and allowed to operate. Cherbourg, the vital port, fell to Allied forces near the end of June, another blow to German hopes of stabilizing supply lines. For German commanders, the loss of Cherbourg meant that the Allies' fragile but growing lifeline across the Channel would be reinforced and sustained. Von Rundstedt's warning about the narrowing window was vindicated on the operational level. Ports and airfields in Allied hands multiplied the reach of Allied logistics and the tempo of their operations. What had been, in late June, a possibility of concentrated German response became, by midsummer, a decreasing probability as Allied assets multiplied and German organizational paralysis persisted. Meanwhile, the political climate in Germany shifted in lethal ways. News of battlefield reverses filtered into an environment already roiling with conspiracies and dissent. Some officers, long resentful of Hitler's control and fearful of strategic ruin, moved from private disquiet to active plotting. The July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, Operation Valkyrie, was complex, combining moral revulsion with pragmatic military calculations. Its conspirators included officers who had seen the strategic picture deteriorate and believed that removing Hitler might allow a negotiated end or at least a more rational prosecution of the war. The plot failed. The regime's response was merciless: public executions, purges, arrests, and an intensification of ideological conformity at the cost of professional competence. The failed coup did not create clarity. It created more fear and a reinforced preference for sycophancy among those who remained in power. Von Rundstedt watched these developments from the margins. His removal from command spared him the immediate personal consequences of the post-July 20 purges, but also emptied him of formal influence at a moment when influence might have mattered. He had been a professional soldier who had spoken plainly and paid for it, not only in dismissal but in the loss of any institutional platform from which to argue for more coherent conduct. The system had, in effect, beaten back the one voice most credible among professional soldiers. The months that followed were a catalogue of grinding decline. The Wehrmacht attempted local counterattacks and, in December 1944, mounted the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, its last desperate bid to reverse the course of the war. That offensive, remarkable for its temporary surprise, demonstrated again the limits of German operational art under the weight of logistical insufficiency and faltering air support. Initially, the Germans enjoyed a degree of tactical success, penetrating thinly defended sectors and causing short-term disruption. But the strategy depended on rapid movement to seize ports and supplies that the Germans simply could not guarantee. Allied air power resumed in force when weather cleared. Allied reserves and logistics blunted the German push, and the offensive collapsed with heavy losses. In the aftermath of the Bulge, the path to the Rhine became clearer for the Allies. Panzer columns that in 1944 might have been used to strike back into Western Europe were now themselves the frustrated remnants of a gambit that had failed to change the strategic calculus. Crossing the Rhine in early 1945, the Allies breached Germany's last major natural barrier in the West. Cities burned, industrial centers were destroyed, and the Reich's capacity to resist dwindled into a sequence of isolated defenses and local surrenders. The final months saw German armies stretched into small pockets, supply lines disintegrated, and civil order in regions rearranged under the pressure of invasion and internal collapse. Von Rundstedt's personal arc continued in this chaos. Historical records show that he was briefly recalled to service later in the war, part of a pattern in which the regime, in its desperation, turned repeatedly to men whose experience it had earlier dismissed. But any return to formal authority was shadowed by the same structural problems: Hitler's political control, the erosion of logistical foundations, and the moral corrosion that had taken hold across the officer class. By the final months of the war, command authority had little purchase on an unraveling front. After the war, von Rundstedt was among many senior officers interrogated and detained. The post-war reckoning with German military leadership was complex. Some were tried and convicted for crimes. Others served as witnesses at trials. Some were released after interrogation. Von Rundstedt was not among those sentenced at Nuremberg to the most severe penalties. But his record did not absolve him from responsibility. His transmission of orders such as the Commando Order, earlier in the war, and his service in a criminal regime implicated him morally and professionally. This duality, that a man could be competent in the technicalities of warfare while complicit in criminal directives, was a recurring theme in the post-war assessments. Historians have wrestled with distinguishing professional ability from moral culpability, sometimes uncomfortably, because the same skills that made officers effective at moving men and guns also made them effective administrators of policies some had known to be criminal. In judging these men, including von Rundstedt, the historian's task is to hold multiple truths at once. On the one hand, von Rundstedt's military judgment about massed armored action was rooted in doctrine and experience, seen by many contemporaries as sound. On the other, serving and enabling a regime that issued unlawful orders and committed atrocities means that professional competence cannot be applauded without reservation. The line between professional obedience and moral agency is not always tidy. Officers exercised judgment and still bore responsibility for choices that hurt civilians and violated international norms. Understanding that complexity does not excuse complicity. It simply resists facile categorization. The larger institutional lesson, however, transcends individual culpability. What Normandy laid bare was the fatal fragility of a system that prized centralized political control over decentralized professional judgment in a context where speed and adaptability were the currency of survival. When leaders create incentives that punish candor, organizations not only lose information, they shatter morale, discouraging initiative precisely when it is most necessary. The German High Command after D-Day is a case study in how an organization's internal rewards can reshape behavior in ways that make collapse more likely. Officers learned that telling the truth could cost them their careers. They learned to translate urgent warnings into palatable formulations or to silence them altogether. The price of that silence was strategic paralysis. This lesson has echoes beyond the battlefield. Any complex organization, corporate, governmental, or military, that discourages honest feedback in favor of affirmation will, over time, erode its capacity to respond to crises. Leaders who equate dissent with disloyalty sacrifice the corrective mechanisms that keep institutions adept. Von Rundstedt's fate is a vivid historical illustration.
A professional voice asked for action and was punished for the candor that forecasted decline. There is also a moral lesson about responsibility in wicked systems. Service within a criminal regime imposes moral obligations that remain even when professional norms complicate judgment. Officers who administer orders that violate basic human protections cannot cloak themselves entirely in the language of duty. Accountability in such contexts requires an honest broker, someone willing to weigh professional demands against basic ethical imperatives. In Germany's case, too few officers chose moral resistance. Too many adapted to the regime's expectations. When resistance did occur, as in the July 20 plot, it was crushed exactly because the system had become so hostile to dissent. The tale of that 19-day warning ends not with one clear what-if, but with a set of sober realities. If von Rundstedt's counsel had been heeded in full and promptly, some tactical outcomes might have been different. Whether strategic reversal was possible is unknowable and, in any case, beside the point. What history demonstrates clearly is that institutional arrangements matter.
The mechanistic centralization of authority in Hitler's hands converted operational choices into political gambits, and the pattern of punishing candor made adaptation improbable. By the time the Wehrmacht sought to mount the kind of concentrated, massed response von Rundstedt advocated, the logistic means and the political will to do so had largely evaporated. The human costs of that evaporation were immense. Soldiers who might have been maneuvered into different positions died in piecemeal counterattacks or in the grinding attrition that followed. Civilians suffered as towns became contested ground. Refugees clogged roads and complicated military movements. The moral accounting of the campaign must hold both the operational tragedies and the ethical failures in the same ledger. Competence in battle cannot erase the complicity in criminal orders, nor can moral clarity alone substitute for professional skill. Both mattered, and both too often failed. In the end, the story closes on a quiet, clinical truth. Organizations that silence the truth do so at their peril. Von Rundstedt spoke plainly. He paid the price. The German command structure, by squelching the candor it needed, accelerated the collapse it feared. That is not a partisan observation so much as a structural one, an observation about incentives and outcomes that applies across time and place. As we look back, we should resist temptation to reduce the episode to a single villain or a single hero. Responsibility for the catastrophic chain of decisions that followed D-Day was diffused across a system. Leaders who centralized power, officers who failed morally in service, political structures that rewarded flattery and punished frankness. Von Rundstedt's message, "Retreat before it's too late," is less an imperative about geography than a moral signal about institutional health. When professionals cannot speak plainly for fear of reprisal, the consequence is not merely inefficiency, it is ruin. If this line of history resonates with you, tell us what lesson about leadership you find most urgent. Was it the danger of centralized authority, the cost of punishing candor, or the moral responsibility of professionals under unjust systems? Leave a comment below. If you want more in-depth examinations of pivotal moments in military history and the leadership lessons they teach, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. We close where the chateau's clock once ticked, with a reminder that wartime choices are human choices, made by people in institutions that can choose to receive bad news or bury it. The German High Command chose burial. History kept the message. The cost was measured in lives, cities, and the moral ledger of a nation that carried its failures long after silence became impossible to sustain.